Our top story, Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered a symmetrical response to the recent U.S. missile test.
I order the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation and other core officers to analyze the level of the threats for our country created by the activities of the United States and to undertake comprehensive measures to prepare the symmetric response.
Putin stressed that Moscow does not want to get involved in an arms race. He said Moscow is still open to an equal and constructive dialogue with Washington to recover trust and to reinforce international security. Putin, however, said that Russia could not stand idly by in response to the U.S.'s move. The Russian leader further renewed criticism of the U.S. for abandoning a Cold War-era nuclear treaty with his country.
All this leaves no doubt what the real intentions of the United States in exiting the INF Pact or getting rid of the exiting limitations to unite its hands to deploy previously banned missiles in different regions of the world.
Earlier this week, the U.S. said it had tested a non-nuclear cruise missile with the target more than 500 kilometers away. It was the first such test since the U.S. pulled out of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF. The U.S. has accused Russia of violating the accord, a claim that Kremlin rejects. Following Washington's pullout, Moscow also followed suit. The deal banned ground-launched missiles with a range between 500 and 5,500 kilometers. It was signed by Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan in 1987.
Do you realize that because of the US ambitions, we are one step away from an arms race that cannot be controlled or regulated in any way?
The United States will not remain a party to a treaty that is deliberately violated by Russia.
If this depended only on us, we would not have reached this dangerous situation.
The United States is taking the necessary steps to address the threat posed by intermediate-range missile forces being deployed in ever larger numbers by Russia and China.
What about you? Are you going to evade responsibility for what is happening? Will future generations forgive you for this?
Russia's present actions are in line with a pattern of aggression that represents a clear threat to international peace and security.
The Russian Federation bears the sole responsibility for the recent demise of the INF Treaty.
Do you not understand that by your response to the Americans, you are returning to a historical situation when missiles were targeting European cities from different sides?
Well, it was a heated debate at the United Nations Security Council. Now, the United States has recently withdrawn from the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Agreement. And not only has the USA withdrawn from the treaty, but the USA recently tested a missile that would have been a violation of that treaty had it still been in effect. Many are viewing this as an escalation of a potential new arms race between Russia and the United States. Now, when the representative of the United States spoke to the Security Council, they accused Russia of being responsible for the agreement's demise. This is the U.S. representative.
You're here today because the Russian Federation preferred a world in which the United States continued to fulfill its INF Treaty obligations, while the Russian Federation did not. We've heard a narrative today that the United States had itself been in violation of the INF Treaty because of our recent flight test, which used the Mk-41 launcher that is also found in our Aegis Ashore missile defense system. This is categorically false.
Now, Russia emphasized that its concerns about the Mk-41 launcher have been proven to be indeed correct, and that this launcher could easily be tested and transformed into the Tomahawk missiles that were recently tested by the United States. And those missiles do indeed violate the treaty. Now, Russia, which had been accused of having violated the INF Treaty, had repeatedly requested that inspectors come to Russia and see if indeed these allegations from U.S. leaders were true. However, the United Nations and the United States ignored their requests to defend themselves against these allegations of violating the INF Treaty. Russia asked for dialogue around the issue, and this dialogue was ignored. Here's some of what we heard from the Russian representative.
In accusing Russia, the United States and the countries that support it are ignoring facts and common sense. We proposed a closed-door meeting to look at our missile of this class and give full information to convince them that it did not violate the treaty, but they refused. We cannot understand the arguments from the US, but we do want to save the treaty.
China was also subject to U.S. allegations at the Security Council. The The United States accused China of boosting its military arsenal as well. China responded that it was not correct for the United States to withdraw from the treaty, and that blaming China for their decision was not honest or correct either. This is the Chinese representative addressing the Security Council.
The INF Treaty is of great importance to not only the US and Russia, but to global peace and security. It is unacceptable to use China as an excuse for leaving the treaty. China rejects the baseless accusations from the US.
Now, the INF Treaty was signed in 1987. It was a key moment in the de-escalation and ultimate end of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. And the recent decision of the United States to withdraw from that treaty has many concerned about the potential for a new nuclear arms race. Now, many hoped that the meeting could be the opening of dialogue toward restoring some kind of treaty regarding intermediate-range nuclear forces, missiles, and such. However, while a lot of accusations were exchanged, no real consensus seems to have existed among the countries represented at the UN Security Council.
Mr. Papadopoulos, Russian President Vladimir Putin has ordered government agencies to take exhaustive measures to prepare a reciprocal response to the recent missile test conducted by the U.S. Are we witnessing the start of a fresh global arms race?
Well, what this latest development demonstrates is that there is an arms race underway between America and Russia, not the kind of arms race that the world was witness to between the United States and the Soviet Union, but nonetheless, an arms race is today underway between Washington and Moscow. And the fact that the world again is witness to an arms race between the two superpowers is solely the fault of the Americans, and it is irrefutable because there is overwhelming evidence to blame the American government for this arms race. If we go back to 1992, just after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Pentagon produced a document called the Defense Planning Guidance, more commonly known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine, known after its architect Paul Wolfowitz, which identified Russia as the only country in the world capable of destroying the United States. And it urged for Washington to take steps to limit Russia's ability. But the problem for the Americans was that standing in their way of tackling the Russian nuclear arsenal and Russia's industrial military complex was the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. So what did the Americans do? They took a number of steps to undermine and ultimately kill the INF Treaty. First of all, at the beginning of 2002, the Americans pulled out of the ABM Treaty. And then in 2006, 2007, the Americans began the construction of a missile defense system in Eastern Europe, which was not only aimed at upsetting the nuclear balance between America and Russia, but also that missile defense system, which is today operational with components in Romania and Poland, can be fitted with offensive missiles. Now, those two acts, withdrawing from the ABM Treaty and constructing a missile defense system in Eastern Europe, severely weakened the INF Treaty. In fact, it ultimately killed it. So that is why we are where we are today. The Americans are taking very decisive and hostile steps to target the Russian nuclear arsenal and to target the industrial military complex of the Russian Federation, because the Americans are acutely aware, as they were back in 1992, that Russia is the only country capable of not just challenging American global hegemony, but of destroying America, literally destroying America. And that is all the more so under Vladimir Putin. So that's why the Americans had to kill the INF Treaty, because in order to take decisive action against Russia, they had to get rid of that INF Treaty, and Russia is merely responding. Russia only 74 years ago lost nearly 30 million people in a world war. They are not going to tolerate any threat to their national security, and they are well within their rights to respond to any American testing of a cruise missile.
Let's bring in Daniel Lazar from New York. Mr. Lazar, Putin said the missile test left, quote, no doubts that the real intention behind the U.S.'s recent decision to withdraw from the INF Treaty was to untie its hands to deploy previously banned missiles in different regions of the world. Do you think that the U.S. was preparing to terminate the INF Treaty all along?
Oh, yes, I think so. I think that was quite clear once Trump brought neocons like John Bolton into his administration, people who are completely opposed to the very idea of nuclear arms control. The U.S. is behaving very aggressively at this point. Trump is trying to assert U.S. global hegemony in a new and aggressive way, even while undermining NATO, for example. And to me, it seems clear that the real target of the latest missile test is not only Russia but China as well. I think the U.S. aims to ring China with a whole cruise missile nuclear attack system because it sees China as a major threat in the Western Pacific. But I also might add that that arms control, the very idea of arms control, is being upset by new generations of missiles coming, new generations of weapons coming online. Not only new cruise missiles, but new and exotic weaponry like hypersonic cruise missiles, which could deliver a nuclear warhead to a foreign city within minutes and would be essentially impossible to defend against. So I think that over the next few years we'll see a singularly energetic move towards development of new generations of missiles with vastly enhanced capabilities.
Marcus Papadopoulos, our guest in New York, mentioned China. Let's talk about some of the reactions to this move by the United States. Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman recently said that the test showed the U.S. was stoking a new arms race and confrontation which would have a serious negative impact on regional and global security. Also, the Trump administration's plans to place missiles in the Asia-Pacific region will also be met with harsh opposition from Beijing as well, won't it?
Indeed, it is not just the Russian Federation that the Americans are trying to encircle and weaken, it is also China. Let us remind ourselves, a few years ago, the Americans installed a missile defense system very similar to the one in Eastern Europe in South Korea. Who is that aimed at? Well, it is aimed once again at the Russian strategic nuclear deterrent, because of course there are many Russian nuclear arsenal sites, land-based in particular, across the whole of Russia, including the Far East. But that American missile defense system in South Korea is also aimed at the Chinese strategic nuclear deterrent. So that is why the Chinese are condemning America's testing of a cruise missile last Sunday, because they know that it is not just aimed at Russia, it is aimed at China. The Americans do not wish to share power in the world with any other country. Any country which challenges America will be, first of all, demonized by American mainstream media. Secondly, that country's economy will be targeted. And thirdly, that country will see an increase of the presence of the American military close to its borders, on the ground, maritime waters, and in the air. So that is why the Chinese have to be very, very careful about this growing threat. But I should make very clear that the Americans pulling out of the INF Treaty was first and foremost aimed at Russia. The Russian nuclear arsenal is by a significant amount the largest in the world. The Chinese nuclear arsenal is, comparatively speaking, very, very small. The only threat, the true threat to American global dominance, comes from Russia. Remember, the Chinese and the American economies are interlocked. China does not want to take on the Americans, though of course they will defend themselves. But of course, it is Russia's mission, it is Russia's destiny to challenge American global dominance and to ensure that in the world there are two superpowers. And if there are two superpowers in the world, then there is more stability, there is more chance for peace. Go back to the 1990s when Russia was on its knees. America was able to do what it wanted. For example, in the former Yugoslavia in the early 2000s, going into Iraq. It's 2019, the situation has changed. Vladimir Putin is in power. He has made Russia a superpower. That is why the Americans are becoming more and more hostile, more and more desperate to take on Russia.
Daniel Lazar, European officials have expressed worries that without this INF treaty, Europe could again become an arena for nuclear-armed intermediate-range missile buildups by both the United States and Russia. Where do you think Europe fits in all of this?
Well, I think those concerns are correct. I think that Europe could really find itself in the middle as it becomes a staging area for U.S. cruise missiles. Frankly, I don't expect the Europeans to react very forcibly. They've shown themselves to be extremely weak and disunited in terms of a response. I wanted to add that the most important arms control treaty that the U.S. has pulled out of is the Iranian nuclear accord. And this also is contributing to a new arms buildup because the U.S. sanctions, the U.S. Economic warfare that is now waging on Iran, since pulling out of that treaty, sends a very clear message that any country which fears invasion or harassment or attack by the U.S., the only recourse it has is to develop nuclear weapons because that is the only logic that Washington understands. So therefore, in the wake of what's happened with Iran, I think we can expect to see many more countries striving to arm themselves with nuclear weapons. And of course, that is extremely dangerous in terms of a global arms race. I mean, the last thing the world needs now is more nuclear proliferation. But Trump's behavior in the Persian Gulf sends a very clear message that is what's going to happen.
Mr. Papadopoulos, speaking of pulling out of international agreements, the new START agreement, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, expires in less than 2 years. Hypothetically, if the Trump administration is still in the White House, do you think that treaty could be at risk too?
Oh, I certainly think so. I think that for the Trump administration, any treaty that stands in its way of preventing America from taking on the Russian nuclear arsenal and from taking on Russia's industrial military complex will have to be undermined and ultimately dismantled. But I would add this as well. No one should be under the illusion that if Mr. Trump loses the next presidential election, that his successor is not going to take the same hardline approach to Russia. Why? Because ultimately, whoever is in the White House, Republican or Democrat, they are merely puppets. The real force in America is, of course, the American establishment or the American elite. The people you don't see in front of the cameras, they are the ones who pull the strings. They are the ones who effectively dictate to whoever's sitting in the White House how America is going to behave in the world, how America is going to take on Russia. So yes, the START treaty is under threat from the Trump administration, but I believe it will be under threat from his successor. And I would agree with the guest in America, and I think it's important that the guest in America brought up the issue about Iran, because what stood in the way of America countering the Russia of today, the INF treaty? What stood in the way of America taking on Iran? The JCPOA. agreement. That is why Trump pulled out, withdrew from that nuclear agreement with Iran, because it prevented America from taking hostile and decisive action to undermine the Iranian government, to undermine the Iranian economy. So that's how the Americans behave. If there is a treaty standing in its way of taking aggressive action against a country that's challenging its dominance, it will get rid of that treaty.
Mr. Lazar, at the time of the terminating of the INF, Washington had accused Russia of aggressive expansionism. It seems to be the other way around, though, as the U.S. has been trying to expand NATO to surround Russia, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the Washington worldview is very much an upside-down worldview, in which countries that are really the victims of U.S. aggression are somehow portrayed as aggressors, and the U.S. is always perennially on the defensive. But it's not true. The U.S. is a highly aggressive superpower in the best of times, and under Trump has turned even more so. So yes, the U.S. has been turning up the gas. It has adopted an extremely hostile attitude towards Russia and to all countries that it sees as somehow within Russia's orbit, and those include Iran, Syria, etc. So, yes, the U.S. is pushing extremely aggressively and extremely dangerously, because at some point, things will spin out of control and a real military confrontation will ensue.
Marcus Papadopoulos, the U.S. has always been playing the role of hall monitor when it comes to arms control, but when will the U.S. itself be ready to discuss arms control and elimination of weapons of mass destruction?
No, it is not in the interests of the American establishment for such a thing to happen. What the Americans are intent on achieving is, number one, safeguarding their global dominance, and number two, strengthening their global dominance. And they have demonstrated since the 1990s that they are prepared to use any means necessary to achieve that. They demonstrated their violent nature in the former Yugoslavia. They demonstrated their violent nature in Iraq, and again in Libya, and again in Syria. They have targeted what Russia calls the near abroad, i.e. countries which used to be a part of the Soviet Union, for example, Ukraine. That is making the world an unbelievably dangerous place to live in. And I take no rejoice in the knowledge that there is an arms race today underway between America and Russia. What sane person would celebrate that? However, there is no choice. If anyone in the world truly supports a more stable, a more peaceful world, then they have to understand that Russia is the only country in the world that can limit American expansionism, that can limit American aggression. And if that means Russia designing and introducing into its nuclear arsenal new missiles, then regrettably, so be it. This is not Russia's fault, this is America's fault. Action, reaction. The Americans have been slapping Russia's face since the 1990s, but since Vladimir Putin came to power, the Americans have now had a taste of their own medicine.
Daniel Lazar, your final thoughts on the issue?
Well, I think the liberal global order is falling apart very rapidly. The neoliberal global order, and diplomatic relations are in disarray all over the world. The very dangerous situation in the Persian Gulf is one aspect of that, and a resumption of a nuclear arms race in any form is another important aspect of that. And Donald Trump represents the rebellion against the status quo, but of course what he wants to replace it with is far worse, a policy of U.S. Egoism, aggression, etc., in which the U.S. feels free to behave in however provocative and aggressive a manner it wishes, and all other countries are expected to back off. But at some point, that strategy will come to an end, because at some point,
Very well.
one of these countries will push back.